Welcome to this session on the Baroque period in Western civilization. I think you'll find that this is a very interesting period as we move from the Protestant Reformation more into modern times. So what does Baroque mean anyway? Baroque seems to be a term that describes the emphasis in art, music, architecture, and other expressions of the 17th century, which would be the 1600s. So now we're talking about an entire century. Main feature would be extravagant and highly ornate art, architecture, and music, and a continuing developing of the division between Catholic and Protestant concepts of beauty and meaning. So it's a development out of the Renaissance with the enhancement of the Protestant Reformation, dividing Western civilization into Catholic and Protestant perspectives. The term Baroque may have come from a Portuguese word, we're not really sure, but it seems to be the word used to describe a pearl that has an interesting and irregular shape to it. So lots of knobs, lots of twists and turns, very ornate, and that describes the Baroque period. So what were some of the factors leading from the Renaissance to the Baroque? It would be the continuing blend of Judeo-Christian values with ancient Greco-Roman styles and themes, which had begun in the Renaissance in the 1400s. Also, the clash between the divine right of kings, which we're going to see featured very much in this session, and the common people's desire for participation in government and society. So this is the beginning of the democratic movements as against the monarchy and the nobility. The rush to colonialism by European powers would be another factor. Spain and Portugal got into the colonial game very early, but England and France are going to be right behind them starting in this period. The Protestant Reformation's emphasis on celebrating everyday living and simplicity in art will be a factor, as well as the partial success of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which tended to celebrate artistic extravagance. So let's begin with a look at the rise of Spain as a world power. Having achieved victory over Islam in 1492, Spain became arguably the most Catholic country in Europe. They had been working on this for centuries. It was February, I believe, of 1492, in which the final Islamic stronghold in Spain had surrendered, and Spain became a united Catholic country. Became the center of a type of Catholic mysticism, too, featured by St. John of the Cross. The Dark Night of the Soul was one of his great works, and St. Teresa of Avila. Spain was also a major center of the office of the Papal Inquisition. So there was the Italian or Roman Inquisition, and then there was the Spanish Inquisition, which tended to feature a real focus on the conversos, the Muslims and Jews who had converted to Catholicism to stay in Spain, to make sure that they were truly Catholic, to make sure that they weren't practicing something else at home. Spain's colonial empire was vast. It eventually spread as far as the Philippines and Asia, and of course all through the Americas. Columbus discovering really the New World officially, I guess you'd say, in 1492. Balboa would be in 1513 discovering that there was an ocean beyond, that the Americas were actually in between Europe and Asia. And Balboa showed that in his discovery through the Isthmus of Panama, that there was another ocean beyond. Cortez, of course, in his conquest of Mexico, really surprising, really astounding conquest of Mexico in 1521 with only really, maybe at the most, 1,500 Spaniards, but they were able to recruit a lot of Native American allies, the Tlaxcalans and some of the others on the coast, I think the Totonacs on the coast, who hated the Aztecs and were very eager to overthrow them. And so Mexico fell within a year. And it became New Spain. It became the newest Spanish colony. Magellan was a Portuguese mariner, but sailed under the Spanish flag. He was the one who circumnavigated the world. He didn't make it himself, but his ship did. And of course, he claimed the Philippines for Spain. And Pizarro, who had been with Cortez in Mexico and had learned a thing or two, went on to conquer Peru in 1533. Factors in Spanish colonialism would be that the Reconquista of the Spanish peninsula away from Islam shifted Spain's focus from inward to outward. They were no longer mainly looking at their own personal issues at home. They were looking outward to this great colonial empire that they were discovering and founding. There was a rivalry with Portugal, always had been, and so they couldn't let the Portuguese get ahead of them, so they had to compete very heavily. Of course, once they got to the Americas, they discovered gold and silver and other minerals, which they quickly shipped back to Spain as much as they could. There were a surplus of young noblemen in Spain in search of adventure. The lands that they had conquered from Islam were being divided and given out to Spanish noblemen, but a lot of the younger brothers didn't get much, and so the New World was a place where they could expand and make their fortunes. And then, of course, the Catholic Church was concerned about the conversion of the Native Americans to the Catholic faith. Some of it was done very high-handedly, very heavy-handedly. Some of it was done with persuasion, and so it was a mixed bag in terms of the conversion. Portugal had, of course, been exploring the Atlantic and Indian Oceans several decades before Columbus. They had arrived in South America just a couple of years, maybe 1 year after Columbus discovered the New World. And after a brief dispute with Spain over the eastern part of South America, Portugal received Vatican recognition. The Pope had to settle the argument, recognition of their right to much of what is now Brazil, and that was settled in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. So really only 2 years after Columbus. They'd already discovered Brazil, and there was already a dispute over who had the right to that colonial possession. Eventually, the Spanish got tired of dealing with the Portuguese and simply annexed Portugal in 1580 and ruled it until it won its independence again in 1640. So really, about 60 years, Portugal just became a province of Spain until they won their independence. Well, Spain's new wealth and dominance allowed the establishment of an absolutist monarchy in Spain. And that was personified by King Philip II, who built a new palace complex 30 miles outside Madrid called El Escorial. It featured a blend of Renaissance and Baroque style. So the outside is kind of Renaissance. The inside, if you look at pictures of it, clearly Baroque. Much more elaborate than anything you would find in the Renaissance. The Spanish Armada was an attempt to bring Catholicism back to England. The Spanish had been upset with England ever since Henry VIII had sent Catherine of Aragon back home. And they had been waiting for their chance, and they wanted to bring England back to Catholicism. So they amassed a huge armada of ships, probably the greatest armada that had ever been assembled until that time in 1588, to conquer England and forcibly bring it back to Catholicism. Of course, the grievances included the insults that they had suffered under Henry VIII, their abandonment of Catholicism, and then, of course, it didn't help that the English pirates were already raiding Spanish treasure fleets coming from Mexico and Peru and taking a lot of that treasure, so the Spanish wanted to retaliate, teach the English a lesson. The Spanish Armada, sent to impose Spain's will, was destroyed in one of those freak, huge, I guess they call them 50-year storms, that destroyed the Spanish fleet, and it made England the dominant naval power in the world. A lot of the ships just simply sank at sea. Some of them were driven onto the coast of Ireland or Scotland or England. And just a very few managed to limp back to Spain in port. It was a complete disaster for Spain. The Spanish Navy did not recover for a long time. And of course, England was left master of the seas. Baroque art in Spain. If you will look in your textbook, you'll see El Greco at the end of the Renaissance. I'm including him in this Baroque session, but he was really kind of at the end of the Renaissance, the beginning of the Baroque, and his famous picture of the burial of Count Orgaz. It features two registers. The upper register is what El Greco imagines heaven to be like. You see the Virgin Mary in blue and red, her classic colors. And you see down at the bottom the realist register. The top is idealist, the bottom is realist. The realist is kind of what it really looked like with the burial of this famous nobleman. The idealist register has to do with what El Greco imagined heaven might be. You see Jesus at the very top, St. Peter with the keys to the kingdom, and the soul of Count Orgaz coming up into heaven. El Greco was actually a Greek, that's why he's called El Greco, but the money for great artists in those days was in Spain, the new, young, rich country. So El Greco made his fortune in Spain. The bottom picture is Diego Velázquez, Las Meninas. Las Meninas means the handmaidens, and you can see young Princess Margarita being painted by Diego Velázquez. And you see that her handmaids are actually, we used to call them midgets. I don't know what the correct term is now, but they're dwarf women, and they're her size. And you see her in this beautiful dress. And if you look in the image, in the mirror, you'll see the reflections of the king and queen who had come down to see how the painting was going. And then, of course, the great literary genius of the Spanish Baroque would be Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, 1547 to 1616. So he's clearly writing in this new Baroque period. His famous work is Don Quixote de la Mancha, and that's a tale of outdated chivalry. It's this exploration of what chivalry should have been and whether it could continue into this new world, this new age. Don Quixote was a nobleman who lived in a dream world of chivalry. His grandfather had been a Spanish knight, but his armor had been rusting in the cellars, and he decided he would take on a quest to be a knight. So on this beat-up old horse in his grandfather's beat-up armor, with his squire, Sancho Panza. Panza, of course, in Spanish means belly, and he's a short, round guy, as opposed to Don Quixote's tall, skinny person. They travel around together looking for noble deeds to do. Don Quixote sees windmills and thinks they're giants that need to be slain. He sees a prostitute beside the road and thinks that she's a damsel in distress. I mean, there's all sorts of adventures that they have, and it's all in Don Quixote's mind. In his mind, he's doing noble things for people, and everybody around him sees that it's not at all what he thinks it is. And that's a great exploration of the difference between mannerism or realism and idealism. And so this is a great exploration of the contrast between the ideal world, things as they should be or as someone wants them to be, and the real world of things as they are. And all of us deal with those two different things in life. We have wishes. We have things that we dearly hope will happen. And sometimes we live in that dream world, and people have to tell us that that's not exactly the way it is. And of course, the real world that we live in. And we go back and forth between those two, the world of idealism and realism. Now let's turn to the Baroque in Italy. And probably the great Renaissance man of the Baroque, just as Da Vinci was for the Renaissance, is Bernini. Bernini is a great architect. He designed the Baldacchino, which is the inside of St. Peter's in the Vatican. You'll see a picture of that in the next slide. He also designed St. Peter's Piazza, which is also part of the Vatican. He was a great sculptor. He sculpted David, and he also sculpted the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. All of these are great Baroque works of art. So you can see the Baldacchino there. It's the top left picture. You can see the ornate altar cover that the Pope often does Mass in. And that's inside the Vatican. I mean, notice it's the pillars have to be swirled like that. That makes it Baroque. Then the top right would be the piazza in front of the Vatican. And notice the shape of it. It's in the shape of a keyhole. Why a keyhole? Because St. Peter, which is the name of the church, St. Peter is supposed to have the keys to heaven. And then bottom right would be Bernini's version of David. He does Michelangelo one better because he shows David in the act of throwing the stone, slinging the stone at Goliath. You can see the muscles in motion. Masterful work of sculpture. And then in the bottom left is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, also by Bernini. Again, the expressions on the face, you see Cupid is, I guess you'd say, piercing Teresa's heart with a dart of love, love for God, love for Christ, and she's in ecstasy with her love there in that statue. And again, that's also in St. Peter's. Here you see some more Italian art, and this features a technique called chiaroscuro, meaning light dark in Italian. Caravaggio was very famous for that. It was very fashionable at the time, but he really was a master of that technique. This is the calling, I believe, of St. Matthew. It's his depiction of it. The costumes are all Renaissance costumes, Baroque costumes, but it pictures Jesus' calling of Matthew. And notice that the light is all on the faces. You don't see a lot of detail in the picture. The dark is to cover the areas that the artist doesn't want you to look at. He wants you to look at the faces of Jesus and the disciples. And so the light is used for that purpose. Gentileschi, Artemisia Gentileschi, was a rarity. She was a female painter, but she often painted anti-male themes because she'd been raped by her painting instructor repeatedly. So she kind of had a thing against men. And here's a picture from the part of the Catholic Bible, the Apocrypha, which the Protestant Bible does not contain. And it is a picture of a woman who is cutting a man's throat. This is also the time in which opera became very prominent, began to become prominent in Italy. Opera is basically a play with costumes and scenes and all the things that go with a play, except it's all done in song. So there's either no spoken lines or very few spoken lines. It's all done with music. There's opera seria, which would be serious opera. The themes would be serious. Opera buffa, which is comic opera. And then the song of I guess you'd say the featured soloist is called an aria, usually an extended song. Concerto is a small ensemble of instruments, usually could be violins and all the other stringed instruments, could be an ensemble of woodwind instruments, but they play in the context of a larger orchestra. So you've got the large orchestra, but then what's featured is this, let's say, this string ensemble that does the main performance. They're the focus of the piece, and the larger orchestra simply supports them at certain crucial times. Probably the best example of that, of Baroque concertos, would be Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Moving to France, you cannot look at France in the Baroque without dealing with Louis XIV, Louis XIV. It was dominated by him as king. He began his reign in 1660. He was an absolute monarch. If we thought Philip II in Spain was absolute, oh no, he's nothing in comparison to Louis XIV in France. He established this absolute monarchy with almost total control over everything. Nobles, government, society. Plays could not be produced and performed without Louis's approval. Music could not be performed. Books could not be written. Almost nothing happened without Louis's consent. And, people didn't like it very much, but that's the way it was in France at the time. Louis dominated arts through his academies. The French language still is influenced by an academy. I've been studying a little French lately, and we have the word pet in English, a pet like a pet dog or a pet cat. The French Academy will not allow official use of borrowed words from other languages, and they're very selective about that. Sometimes they do, but for the most part, they don't really allow it. It's not official. People can do it themselves if they want, but it's not really the right way to do French. So they won't borrow our word pet. The word pet is animal de compagnie. So companion animal, animal de compagnie. So again, it's the result of the French Academy, which allows certain words or doesn't allow certain words. Very different than English. English doesn't really have an academy. If a word becomes common usage, it's just added to the dictionary. Louis's great architectural achievement was the Palace of Versailles, which he built just outside of Paris. Great architectural and artistic achievement during the Baroque. French Baroque art featured artists like Peter Paul Rubens. He was not French, he was Flemish, again, from that area of northern Belgium, Dutch-speaking area. But he painted French royal portraits and classical themes. There you can see a portrait of himself. Nicolas Poussin introduced a very cool neoclassical style. We'll see that featured in the next period, the Enlightenment, neoclassicism, but it was begun by Poussin and some others here in the Baroque. And you can tell Poussin's use of colors, it's very soothing. The greens and the blues are soothing colors. Notice the featured items, though, have the reds and the yellows in them that he wants you to look at in this cool scene. Now let's talk about the Protestant Baroque. Let's look at music in Germany. Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. He wrote over 300 cantatas. Cantatas are made to be used a lot of times in church music. So it's just a choir performing the songs, and they were written at least Bach wrote them for Lutheran worship. He also wrote the Brandenburg concertos. Another German composer, but we're going to classify him as English, is Handel. Handel was a German composer working for the Hanoverian Royal House of England. Well, interesting understanding of how this worked. When the English royal line did not have an heir, what happens? Well, you have to go to the nearest relative. In this particular period of the Baroque, there was no nearest relative in England. You had to borrow a relative from a neighboring country, which would be, in this case, Hanover. Hanover is now part of Germany, but it was then an independent entity. And so George Duke of Hanover became King George I of England. Spoke no English, only German. His son George II, I believe, was bilingual. And his son, George III, that we overthrew in the American Revolution, he was thoroughly English, but of German background. In fact, the Royal House of England now is quite thoroughly German in many ways. Still is. Anyway, so George brought over his people with him, including his favorite composer, Handel. So Handel's a German guy working in England. We're going to classify him as an English composer. He specialized in the oratorio. An oratorio is basically an opera without any costumes or scenery. It's just performed by a choir. And his best-known work is The Messiah, and we're going to listen to some of that in this session. Protestant Baroque featured great painters. Some of them would be Dutch. Vermeer painted what we call genre scenes from everyday life. This is probably a great example of Protestant art. Why would you paint a milkmaid pouring milk into a bowl? The Catholics would never have dreamed of doing such a thing. The Catholics wanted to paint great people doing great things. But again, Protestantism said that ordinary people doing ordinary things can glorify God. And so here is Vermeer saying that a milkmaid who is doing what she's doing with a heart for God is a glorious thing. Rachel Rausch, female artist, again, rather rare, but she painted still lifes, fruit in bowls, flowers in vases. Really quite amazing. You can almost smell the perfume from those flowers. Another Dutch painter was Rembrandt van Rijn. He did paintings and engravings, and I just wanted to pick out of the many paintings he did, two of his own self-portraits. The one on the left is himself as a younger man, lots of hope, lots of idealism, and then towards the end of his life, he painted this picture of a rather disappointed and weary older man. He'd been through a lot in his life. He'd been a social outcast. He'd made a fortune and lost it. And so, it just kind of shows the wear and tear that life can have on you. And then this is a famous etching. Etching is how you etch things into a plate of lead that has been covered with beeswax. And you take a needle-like instrument and you you scratch away the beeswax. And so then once the beeswax is washed off, some parts of the lead plate are higher than others, and they take the ink, and the parts that are etched deeper into the plate don't take the ink, and they are the lighter pieces. And it's really, you have to almost do it in reverse. It's like making a photographic negative, and so that's really an amazing thing. It's called the 100 Guilder print. In England, there was a civil war during this time in which the English overthrew their king. Their king was supported by the Cavaliers or Royalists, and the rebels were known as Roundheads. The result was, in 1649, the English monarchy was temporarily replaced when Charles I was put on trial for treason, and his head was removed from his body, and the monarchy was replaced temporarily by a Puritan Commonwealth. I think the Commonwealth lasted 12 years. It failed. The monarchy was reinstated in 1660 under Charles II. I believe he was the grandson of Charles I. And it spurred the great Puritan migration to Massachusetts Bay and other American colonies. So, in other words, the Puritans had run things for a while. They were the more radical Protestants, and they had promised a better government in England. Actually, they weren't very efficient. So when the Royalists took over again under Charles II, Puritans became very much in disfavor, which caused the many, many Puritans in different parts of England to feel like there was no future for them in England anymore. And so with the establishment of Massachusetts Bay Colony and Virginia and many of the other colonies set up in North America, many of them began to migrate. And so really, I think the number was something like 30,000 Puritans migrated over a period of maybe a couple of decades to North America in Massachusetts and other colonies. Probably the best known art in England during the Baroque was in the form of architecture. And in 1666, London experienced a great fire, which allowed Christopher Wren, the great English architect, to redesign London on a grand scale. He designed 53 churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral, and other public buildings which are still standing. One of the times that my wife and I were in London, we actually ate our lunch on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral. Magnificent building. In literature, John Milton wrote Paradise Lost, and John Donne wrote his romantic poetry. Baroque philosophy and science included Galileo in 1630, who refined and expanded the astronomy of Copernicus. Galileo was the one who mathematically proved that the sun is the center of the solar system and the planets revolved around that. Sir Isaac Newton, of course, lived at the end of the Baroque and provided mathematical proof of the theory of gravitation. In philosophy, René Descartes was French. He came up with the slogan, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. In other words, I know I exist because I am thinking. I'm not a figment of my own imagination. And so he began his philosophy with that. His idea was, I have to start with something I can be sure of, and I can be sure that I'm thinking. So he built his rationalist philosophy, starting with the fact that he knew he existed. And so he would be what we would call the father of modern Western philosophy. John Locke is more or less the father of modern scientific method. We call his method empiricism. You only admit as evidence things that you can touch, taste, smell, see. In other words, empirical facts, things that you can prove in a laboratory. There's much more we can say about the Baroque, but that will have to do for today. We'll see you next time when we talk about the Enlightenment.